Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 282. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, talking about news from the Middle East and Africa. A lot of important stuff to cover, so share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost it on the blog at antiwar.com. You can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. You can subscribe to the video version of the show at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee. Audio-only podcast is up anywhere you could listen to podcasts, and then also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. And you can donate to the show at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Crypto. All that information in the show notes page. You can also find the information for our sponsor, Paloma Verde, in the show notes page, palomaverdecbd.com. And when you check out, you use the promo code PEACE. That will save you 20% and get the show a kickback. There's a lot of high quality CBD products at Paloma Verde, and you know that because they post the lab tested results right there on their website. The soft gels, gummies, Edstrats, all absolutely excellent, but my absolute favorite is the sports cream. I plug it all the time because I use it all the time. Fantastic for relieving any kind of, pain you got in your muscles, neck, back, knees. It's very helpful with, and not an offensive smell at all like some of the other topical pain relief products that you're going to get at your pharmacy. A nice refreshing menthol smell, and then it lasts for quite a long time. I find I get like 4 hours of relief, and usually by then I've moved around enough for the day that I don't even have to reapply anything and just, feeling pretty good. So PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. All right, now let's get into the show. So I want to use today's show to catch up on news from the Middle East and Africa from over the past couple months, really, because so much of the content on the show has been focused on Venezuela, North Korea, China, but almost mainly Iran and Russia. And I think there's a lot of important reasons to do that, but at the same time, of course, everything going on in the other parts of the world is extremely important. And, why even I have devoted so much of my attention to the war in Ukraine, the, bodies caused by the U.S. empire's wars in these other countries has continued to mount completely unnoticed. So, it's very disappointing. But let's get into this. So Turkey has been carrying out military options in Iraq and Syria for years and years, well over a decade now in Syria. And then they've had troops in northern Iraq since the time ISIS took Mosul, and, ISIS was operating in northern Iraq, but they have stayed and waged a campaign against, I think, mostly Turkish Kurds, not really Iraqi Kurds. And so I'll go with the Iraq first and talk about this because this has been going on a little bit longer. Then I'll get into the newer developments with Syria. So, Jason Ditz, I have one of his articles here from antiwar.com from May 22nd, just kind of highlighting what this military conflict looks like and what kind of news we really get from it. So he writes, Turkey's military operation against the PKK in northern Iraq continues apace with drone strikes on Saturday, killing at least 5 people, including 3 PKK suspects and 2 civilians. A third civilian was killed in another strike. The 5 were in a civilian car in the Tutakwal village when attacked by the apparent Turkish drone. It set fire to the car, killing all within. Turkey did not indicate its involvement in the strike, nor indeed how they targeted the car. Locals are reportedly informed Kurdistan officials of the PKK's presence. The killing of 2 civilians angered some locals who say they were farmers who had offered to take 3 injured PKK fighters for medical help. And so Turkey has hundreds of soldiers in the ground on Iraq, but they are heavily relying on airstrikes, and particularly drone strikes. Turkey does have one of the more advanced drone programs in the world. Of course, America and China are maybe 1, 2, but Turkey is probably a close third if you look at the impact that the drones have had in mountainous environments, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then Ethiopia, and now on the battlefield in Ukraine. Not, I guess, to promote every last narrative around how effective those drones have been in Ukraine, we have seen in the other two that those drones have helped to turn the tide of the battles and have been extremely effective. And so, Turkey is now using these drones in Iraq. I'm not sure exactly when they started. They've been carrying out airstrikes in northern Iraq for years, but I think for a long time they were with standard manned aircraft and not drones. This is kind of the report we get almost daily from Iraq, or at least every other day, of a couple civilians being killed in one of these strikes. Less frequently, we get reports on the actual fighting between Turkey and the PKK groups. Turkey will claim to neutralize terrorists. Typically, the casualties, at least as reported in the international press, are more PKK members are dying than Turkish soldiers, even when it's, the direct on the ground conflicts. But Turkish soldiers are dying here as well. Now, let's see. I guess I want to move on and talk about the Turkish operations in northern Syria, because they have announced a renewed offensive along the 30 kilometers deep into Syria, along the Turkish-Syrian border. So if you're going, I guess that would be west to east along the Turkish Syrian border, first you would have the Idlib province, which is, even by U.S. officials, referred to as Al-Qaedistan, Al-Qaeda safe haven, the world's largest Al-Qaeda safe haven. Throughout the Syrian war, the Assad government and their Iranian and Russian and Hezbollah partners negotiated deals with both ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters to get them to surrender rather than fighting protracted conflicts in cities. And when they surrendered, they were relocated to the Idlib province and disarmed at least some of their larger weapons. And through time, this has created, I think 2 million people now live in Idlib. Most of those are, just civilians, but thousands and thousands of fighters, including Uyghur fighters from Xinjiang, China, and from all over the Middle East, and, foreigners from tons of countries, they're now there. And Turkey is maintaining observation posts along the line of control and has negotiated deals with Russia to keep the fighting in this region down to a minimum. I think to some extent, Syria, Assad, and Putin must be happy enough with the status quo there that they really don't want to go and fight all those Al-Qaeda fighters and figure out what to do with everybody who surrenders, to leave them, more or less there. However, fighting flares up every now and again, and the Syrian or Russian government will carry out airstrikes against what they claim are Al-Qaeda targets, although they typically report at least some civilians killed in those strikes. So that's Idlib, and then you move over to Afrin, which is a region of Syria that is a little, I guess, Turkish exclave. And a few years back, after the Kurds there declared, I don't know if they declared independence, but they definitely said, this is our little territory now. The Turks came in, said, nah, and they're, very disturbing videos from this time of, Turkey coming in and just looting and taking everything from these people, strikes carried out against hospitals, things like that. So this was really disturbing. I think Turkey's called this Operation Olive Branch. And then they've also had Operation Euphrates Shield, where they've taken territory further to the east of here, including, I think, either Manbij or Al-Bab is about where the end of the Turkish controlled territory is. But they have moved along the Turkish-Syrian border for the, all the way moving to Iraq, in the past few years, after Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal of troops, although that was like a faux withdrawal because obviously we still have all of our soldiers there, but U.S. troops did move away from that border, and then Turkey did move some troops into Syria at that time, but now they're claiming they're going to establish this 30-kilometer wide buffer zone all throughout the border, all the way. And then there's a lot of suspected that this means basically an ethnic cleansing campaign against the Kurds in this region. So I think those concerns are pretty justified, and we have seen in Afrin and other areas, Turkey use some pretty brutal tactics, and also the Syrian Kurds to have used like suicide tactics and at least car bombings targeting soldiers and things like that in an effort to fight back against the occupation, or what they feel is an occupation. Now, unlike who Turkey is targeting in Iraq, where they say it's the PKK, which is a Turkish group, the Iraqi Kurds would be more the Peshmerga. While the Kurdish attacks occur in Iraqi Kurdistan, I don't think Turkey, as far as I've read and seen, is really attacking Peshmerga targets all that frequently. In Syria, it's a little bit more interesting because while Turkey will label them all the PKK, it really is the YPG or the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who the U.S. has backed in Syria for years and armed in Syria for years and years and years as a counter to ISIS and Assad. And it's with the SDF as the local proxy that the U.S. is occupying a third of Syria and stealing their oil. And so, unlike in Iraq, this may be a little bit more offensive to the United States and the empire. Now, I think we really have to look at the situation in Ukraine to understand what's going on here. Like all American wars, the Kurds are going to get the raw end of it. And I think that we're going to see this here again, where as the West attempts to add Finland and Sweden into NATO, there's going to be, Turkey is going to seek concessions on various issues. They're talking about U.S. air bases in Greece, certainly Cyprus, or fuel rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. But one of the things that Turkey really seems concerned about is the Kurdish issue. It is a domestic issue, and so I suspect that they will seek concessions from the West, with getting, supporting the Kurds less, to withdrawing some support, forcing the Western countries to withdraw some support of the Kurds. And then also, I think we will see potentially, some of these countries even like extradite some Kurdish, exiles in their countries. I think that's some of the demands that Turkey is making, but certainly I think the Kurds will get the raw end of this deal, as they typically do when these kind of things happen. Now, one more story on Iraq, and that is just the Iraqi government says there's no justification for the March Iranian attack in Erbil. Iran says they struck an Israeli Mossad target. Iraq is just saying that they haven't received any evidence to justify this. All right, and one more story from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. U.S. France to supply Iraq with new advanced weapons. May 8th, Iraqi state media is reporting that the defense ministry signed a series of contracts with the United States and France to import a number of new advanced weapons, as that terms of this deal have yet to be made public. All right, now let's talk about Syria, where one of the most interesting recent developments is that Russia fires S-300 at anti-aircraft missiles at attacking Israeli planes in Syria. And so this from Jason Ditz, May 16th at antiwar.com. In an incident which could suggest a significant shift in policy, the most recent Israeli attack on the Syria in Hama saw Russian forces firing on them with S-300 anti-aircraft missiles. The planes were not in danger, but this is the first time Russia has taken such action to fire on them. Syria has a large quantity of Russian-made anti-aircraft systems, and the Syrian military itself has regularly used them to intercept or chase Israeli warplanes. Russia has provided Syria with those weapons and has provided upgraded versions like the S-300. Those weapons have remained in Russian hands. The systems are positioned around Russian facilities in the west of the country. Russia has at times objected to Israeli attacks in Syria and ordered them away from the coast. Israel sometimes claims an understanding, though this firing suggests that this understanding is increasingly limited. The S-300 are very capable sort of anti-aircraft missiles and capable of threatening Israeli warplanes all over Syrian airspace. This is clearly a fight Israel wouldn't want. It may be too soon to draw any conclusions from this, but Israel is likely to be more reluctant on casually striking Syria in the near future if they aren't sure of the response they will get. And so this is another story, of course, where I have to mention Ukraine, and to think that this may be related, as Israel was once mediating talks between Russia and Ukraine, and then the relationship, because of, I think, probably the position Israel took on Ukraine, plus the statements from the Russian Foreign Ministry, likely deteriorated the relationship between the two countries enough that that might have something to do with Russia carrying out these strikes or these missile attacks. And again, it does say in the article that it wasn't like they actually were trying to shoot down the Israeli planes, merely just kind of saying that, hey, we have these systems in this region. All right, so we have a Pentagon report on the 2019 strikes that killed 60-something people, mostly civilians, and they found that no one's going to be held accountable, and the U.S. announced a new round of sanctions on people in Turkey and Indonesia for supporting the Islamic State. Next up, we're talking about Yemen, where there has been a 2-month-long ceasefire, and in some good news, deal reached to allow Yemen's Sana'a airport to reopen. This from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Efforts to take the ongoing Yemen ceasefire and use it to improve travel and aid delivery continue apace, with 2 more fuel shipments arriving at the port of Hodeidah. Unlike previous ship deliveries, these ships were allowed through by Saudis without delay. That's a nice step forward, and even bigger one may be coming, as the Saudis and pro-Saudi officials have agreed to allow Yemenis with passports issued by the Houthis to travel, a deal which is set to resume commercial airline travel from Sana'a airport. Yemen's pre-war capital Sana'a is home to a substantial international airport, though it has been shuttered on and off as the Saudis have attacked the runways and prevented flights. The ability to get people in and out of Sana'a, the de facto capital of the Houthis, is a big step forward for potential peace talks. The airport being reopened will allow appropriate diplomats to attend meetings abroad and mean the Houthis would be less reliant on indirect talks. So, this is big news. I actually saw that one of the first charter flights out of there was some people who were just really want to go visit family, things like that. I think one older woman who was looking for some healthcare outside of Yemen, since the healthcare system there is so depleted. So overall, the past 2 months in Yemen have been some of the best in the country in the past 10 years, which is the little bit of good news. Now, the bad news is the 2-month-long ceasefire is set to expire tomorrow, June 2nd, and it is unclear at this point if it's going to be extended. At least publicly, the Houthis have indicated they would like to extend the ceasefire, although, it's unclear what backroom talks are going on and how reasonable everybody's positions are on this issue. Now, I got Houthis open Biden is planning to meet with Mohammed bin Salman in June, I think in Saudi Arabia. Now, this is one of the worst leaders in the world, and what Saudi Arabia, along with the U.S., has been doing to Yemen is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. At least 400,000 people dead so far. That number likely far, far higher. But just the fact that he's going to go meet with the MBS while talking about how the world is divided into autocracy versus democracy and all this is absolutely ridiculous. Now, Saudi Arabia keeps doing really terrible things, and I think they just sentenced a child to death. And so this is prompting some resistance and some people in the Democratic Party to demand Biden walk back his plan to meet with MBS, but I don't know how likely that is, and certainly we won't see an actual fundamental change in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. All right, let's move on and talk Somalia. This article from Daniel Larison on May 16th. Biden escalates in Somalia. It's absurd to think that al-Shabaab poses any threat to the United States, so it's hard to see how any genuine U.S. security interests are served by expanding our role in the war. Dan writes, Biden is sending more troops back into the endless wars. President Biden has signed an order authorizing the U.S. military to once again deploy hundreds of special operations forces inside Somalia, largely reversing the decision by President Donald J. Trump to withdraw nearly all 700 ground troops who had been stationed there, according to officials familiar with the matter. In addition, Mr. Biden has approved a Pentagon request for standing the authority to target about a dozen suspected leaders of al-Shabaab, the Somali terrorist group that is affiliated with al-Qaeda, three of its officials said. Since Mr. Biden took office, airstrikes have largely been limited to those meant to defend partner forces facing immediate threat. The earlier withdrawal from Somalia did not mean that the United States was no longer involved in the conflict, but pulling troops out was one of the few things that Trump got right. Reversing that withdrawal is a mistake, and launching more strikes in Somalia practically guarantees that more Somali civilians will be killed by the U.S. attacks. U.S. military involvement in Somalia is relatively limited, but it is still unnecessary and ill-advised. Limited U.S. involvement is how it has been possible the last three presidents and now Biden to wage war there that most Americans know nothing about. That has happened because there has been scant oversight, no pressure on any administration to justify the continuation of war. And so just a little bit more detail here. In the waning days of the Trump administration, Donald Trump signed an order moving all U.S. forces in Somalia out of Somalia and repositioned almost all of them in neighboring countries. And the Pentagon started doing what it labeled commuting to work. This is from the AFRICOM head. And they were basically just, sending troops to Somalia in groups for days at a time rather than having them deployed there in permanent bases. And so it really wasn't an improvement, but it kind of is. And then Biden is now reversing that and moving the troops back into Somalia, on a permanent basis. Now, I think potentially more significantly is that Biden also seems to be adjusting his drone policy and loosening those rules, making them far more similar to Trump's than potentially even Obama's. Now, under Obama, there were only a few airstrikes in Somalia a year. It went up to scores of airstrikes a year in the Trump administration. Almost no reporting was done on this. And anytime reporting was done, it turned out that, it was almost mostly civilians that were being killed in these airstrikes. And so the Biden administration initially seemed to take some measures to curtail the strikes, but now it seems he's delegating more authority down the chain to carry out the strikes, which will likely mean more dead civilians. Now, there is some political change happening in Somalia, and it's kind of difficult to keep up with who's who. If you look at Somalia, there's about 4 different regions that operate somewhat independently of each other. The south is held by Al-Shabaab, the organization that has sworn allegiance to Al-Qaeda. I wouldn't really call it an international terrorist group. It's mostly concerned about Somali politics, and maybe if you want to extend into some of Kenya or Ethiopia. But that's mainly even, I think, a reaction to the fact that those countries are used by the United States or as either proxies or, as bases to carry out the U.S. attacks in Somalia. And Al-Shabaab is mainly a Somali group. And so, they control the south of the country. Then you have the Somali government in Mogadishu. And then you also have Somaliland and Puntland, who have, to some extent, their own independent governments. The U.S. bats different forces in Somalia. And recently, they've been more, focused with fighting with each other than themselves. So the situation in Somalia is not good. And as me and Will Porter wrote a few months ago, the food situation there is getting pretty poor, and putting people at a lot of risk for starvation, and that's only going to get worse as Biden is sending troops into the country. All right, next up, Sudan. This from Dave DeCamp, May 31st at antiwar.com. U.S. suspends Abraham Accords for Sudan, wants Israel to denounce coup. So, the U.S. has suspended aid to Sudan's post-coup government, including assistance to Sudan, for agreeing to normalize with Israel as a part of the U.S. brokered deals known as the Abraham Accords. The State Department spokesperson told the Times of Israel, the United States is not moving forward at this time with the assistance originally committed to Sudan's civilian-led transition government in connection with its efforts to improve Sudan's bilateral relationship with Israel. The spokesperson said that other aid not related to the Israeli normalization deal was also suspended, and said the U.S. wants Israel to call for the restoration of democracy in Sudan. We want to strongly encourage the state of Israel to join us and the broader international community in vocally pressing for Sudan's military leaders to cede power to a credible civilian-led transitional government, he said. Since the military coup in Sudan that took place in the fall, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has run the country. Israel and Sudan agreed to normalize relations in October of 2020, but full diplomatic relations have not yet been established. While the U.S. wants Israel to call for democracy in Sudan, the other countries Israel normalized relations with in the Abraham Accords, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, are monarchies. Israel has also had diplomatic relations with Egypt for a decade, which is led by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who came to power after a military coup in 2013. Despite the coup, Cairo is still one of the top recipients of U.S. military aid. And so, you could see the hypocrisy there. I'll just add to that a little bit by saying that the Abraham Accords was a part of a shakedown the Trump administration carried out against the Sudanese government, where to get Sudan off the terrorism list, they had Sudan normalize relations with Israel and pay $300 million to the United States. Now, I guess the idea being for Sudan, being an impoverished country, was that you're going to get aid back from the United States, and so it's not that big of a loss to have to pay this $300 million to the U.S. But now that a new coup government has seized power in Sudan, of course, the U.S. doesn't want to give out the aid, even though it took the $300 million. Seems kind of shady to me. Now, this is a big deal that the U.S. is cutting this aid, I guess, and I'm in no way in support of the U.S. giving military aids to Sudan, but, given that the U.S. has done quite a bit of damage to Sudan through our policies and through direct military actions, it's not actually impossible that, a little bit of aid for the people of Sudan wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, especially after, again, the U.S. government just stole $300 million from the Sudanese people. Now, elsewhere in Sudan, their protests are continuing to go on, but I think less frequently at this point, against the coup government. There have been some actions like blocking the border crossing with Egypt, and then there are also people fleeing to Egypt as the conditions in Sudan continue to deteriorate, and there's reports that once they arrive in Egypt, they're arrested and being subject to forced labor. The last thing I'll note on Sudan is there's fighting going on in the Darfur region. This is mostly described as ethnic violence, and over the course of a couple weeks, 200 plus people were killed. All right, let's wrap up here by talking about Africa Sahel region. This Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and a few other countries, have territory in that region. But the first thing I'll note here is an article from Dave DeCamp from April 14th. Biden administration approves $1 billion attack helicopter sale for Nigeria. The State Department has approved an arms sale for Nigeria worth nearly $1 billion, despite concerns over the African country's human rights record. The sale is for 12 AH-1Z Cobra attack helicopters and related equipment worth an estimated $1 billion, according to the Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency. The primary contractors for the deal are Bell and General Electric. Nigeria is often accused of killing civilians in its operations against Boko Haram and other Islamic militants. To offset the rights concerns, the weapons packages include $25 billion for training, for training on human rights. The case will include special training on the law of armed conflict and human rights, and air-to-ground integration to minimize civilian harm in air operations, the DSCA said. But the U.S. military has its own history of killing civilians in airstrikes with no accountability. So how the U.S. is going to train the Nigerian military in something it doesn't even do is concerning. Now, I guess there could be different indicators and things like that you could let people know that could help cut down on civilian casualties. But my guess is, looking at some of the civilian casualty incidents in Nigeria that I've covered, they're not, I wouldn't say the soldiers are going out to kill civilians. It's just if they could kill some bad guys, they really don't care, which again is about the U.S. policy on these issues. As far as the Sahel goes, I don't have any news on Burkina Faso. My understanding, the new coup government is still in charge and things are just going on. Niger, Mali, Nigeria are all facing, weekly attacks from jihadist groups, either against military installations or just straight up civilian targets. And then there's also, I think, other ethnic violence occurring, scores of people killed in attacks. Sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 20, sometimes it's 50, sometimes it's 100, sometimes it's more. And it's hard to report on because, you just have like local officials blame this group claims responsibility. And while that can be helpful, it isn't always accurate. So I find a lot of this hard to cover, but I do want to mention that it does seem there is a significant violence in the Sahel region continuing to go on. In Mali, we're seeing the most change as the military junta that took power a while ago now, almost a year, I think, has withdrawn from the G5. It was a group of 5 anti-jihadist coalition of Sahel countries. They were receiving backing from Western countries to carry out, these military operations. Mali is now working with Russia. There's also allegations that Mali is working with the Russian Wagner group, and with working with those mercenaries have killed scores of civilians. It's unclear to me if that's true. A lot of the reporting that I'm seeing, you have to make a couple jumps. They say, oh, we found mass graves on a satellite and we think people killed people around this time, so therefore it's those people there in the mass graves. It's possible. It's not confirmed, especially when you look at how the politics play out here. Everybody looking to demonize Russia. Everybody wants to get Mali back in line, to get, the Western soldiers back in there. And so it could be that that's more of a propaganda play than an actual event that occurred. Now, fighting continues in the Congo. Lots of people dying there. The Congolese army is carrying out operations along with Ugandan forces, and then there's been other various groups that are carrying out attacks. In the Congo, I find it almost the hardest to try to figure out who is carrying out various attacks, because numerous groups will sometimes claim responsibilities and the local authorities will point to something else. Recently, there was an attack on a village where 10 plus people were killed. The local authorities said it was the Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF, while ISIS claimed responsibility. And then again, there's just so many militant groups in the Congo with so many different motivations. Codeco, this militant group, has been very active, reported recently, and carried out quite a few attacks and slaughtering numerous civilians. I haven't seen a lot of reporting around the success of the military operations going on in the Congo, and how the troops are behaving. My guess is not very well, but who knows? One last thing I'll mention on Africa: the UK has this really nasty plan where not all, but some asylum seekers who show up in the UK crossing the channel are going to be sent to Rwanda. Why exactly Rwanda is unclear to me, but it seems to be the UK's way of discouraging the wrong kind of asylum seekers from showing up at their doors. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Again, I had a very busy weekend at the Libertarian Party convention in Reno. I had a great time. I got to meet a lot of listeners of the show, a lot of fans of the show, and it was absolutely awesome and just a super cool experience to meet people who are like, hey man, I really like the show. So I enjoyed that, and more importantly, we got Angela McArdle elected as chair of the party, so I'm hoping for to see a more bold anti-empire, anti-war message coming from the Libertarian Party in the future. And then, because of that, I'm still catching up on news. So obviously, I'm behind on episodes for the week. I am going to try to put out 3 this week, but can't promise that. Connor should be back tomorrow with an episode on Iran. And then I'm going to try to do an episode on Ukraine, Russia, and NATO on Friday. So that's the tentative plan for the week. Also trying to catch up on writing and stuff like that. Lots of important stuff going on. So just be sure to follow my work so you catch everything I'm doing at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter. Thanks everyone.